to thank the Center for Financial Accountability for facilitating this whole event. To me, it was an eye-opener reading this report. I knew that there have been people's tribunals earlier, independent people's tribunals earlier, including the one in 2007. But this report was both revealing and disturbing. In the first place, the report talks of India's increasing debt trap. And it says, and I wish to quote, the debt trap, according to World Bank's International Debt Report 2024, shows that India's external debt has seen a significant rise over the past 2 decades, reaching $648.6 billion by the end of 2023, from $290.4 billion in 2010. A substantial 77% of this debt is long-term, while the remaining is short-term, making the country highly vulnerable to external financial pressures. Approximately 1/3 of India's external debt is owed to multilateral institutions, with the World Bank accounting for 11% of the total. Now, this kind of information is rarely made public by the government of India itself, even during its budget presentations. So I think the layperson in India is unlikely to realize what is this extent of external debt that India faces. And as a result, the findings of this Independence People's Tribunal reveals that the World Bank Group operates far beyond the role of a financial lender. It has strategically leveraged its funding to shape India's economic, social, and political landscape. Through its lending instruments, policy advisories, and technical assistance, the bank has embedded neoliberal economic and governance frameworks that prioritize privatization, deregulation, and fiscal restructuring. While it presents itself as a development partner, its interventions have systematically influenced national policies, often aligning them with global financial interests rather than domestic priorities. So when we are told in the public domain by the government, either through the Prime Minister or the Finance Minister, that this is the new policy thrust that India is putting forth for reaching, let's say, a 5 trillion growth, little bit do we realize what is driving this change, what is driving this push, and who are the real beneficiaries of such economic policies. Having been involved in some of these issues as a lawyer prior to becoming a judge, and later encountering some of these issues as a judge, one increasingly realizes that what is projected before the courts is only one part of the reality. Very often when courts put a stamp of authority on what is said to be within the realm of policy and therefore outside the sphere of law, the courts don't quite realize that they're not simply endorsing some sovereign function of the Indian government, but they're actually putting a stamp of approval on a policy that is dictated by external factors. And a reading of a report like this makes it very stark what these external factors and external pressures on the Indian government are. And therefore, I would think that this report is very timely. It is a reminder of what many of us have known for many years. And it is at one level disturbing to see that the problem has only increased and has nowhere been mitigated over the last, let's say, 2 decades. I begin by referring to the Human Development Index reports, the HDI reports that have been systematically brought out over the past 2 decades. The Human Development Report for 2023-2024 was titled Managing Interdependence in a Polarized World. As many of us know, the HDI, the Human Development Index, measures human development in countries by analyzing their performance in 3 dimensions: health, education, and standard of living. The health dimension is assessed by life expectancy at birth. The education dimension measured by the years of schooling for adults aged 25 years and more, and the expected years of schooling for children of school entering age. The standard of living dimension is measured by the gross national income per capita. India's rank, which was 134 out of 191 countries in 2022, has improved to 130 in 2025. The Human Development Report of 2023-2024 noted that emerging from conflicts, persecution, and human rights violations, the number of people forced to flee their homes reached 108 million, the highest since World War II, and 2.5 times the number in 2010. And this does not include, and this is important, this displacement does not include the latest displacements, Palestinians in Gaza, the Armenia refugee crisis, among others. 1 in 5 children globally lives in or is fleeing conflict. Millions of people, including children, who have been forced to flee their homes due to no fault of their own, could live a life of dignity if countries, involved or not involved in the conflicts, could find mutually agreeable solutions for displaced people. It talks of the emerging democracy paradox, and this is important for us to note. Nearly 9 in 10 people believe that democracy is a fundamental pillar of political systems, but support for leaders who may bypass the fundamental rules of democratic process has markedly increased. Today, more than half of those polled express support for such leaders. And we're seeing, therefore, a global trend where dictatorial regimes have emerged through political process, through these so-called democratic processes, and have irreversibly changed the direction of the so-called development through economic policies, not dictated by people's interests, but dictated by corporate interests. And this report that we've released today vindicates this understanding of what has happened world over in the last 2 decades, and with particular reference to India. The 2023-2024 Human Development Report, which was titled Breaking the Gridlock, made it clear that our limitations are not technological but sociological. Many of the crises and inequalities we face persist, not because solutions are lacking, but because we have failed to act. And this is the important thing for the 2025 report, where it focuses on artificial intelligence. And it states, with artificial intelligence, we must choose differently. And we must choose now. We must resist the temptation to anthropomorphize AI. And yet, in many ways, it acts as a mirror, reflecting and amplifying the values, structures, and inequalities of the societies that shape it. AI does not act independently of us. It evolves through our decisions and our priorities. If we fail to address the injustices and that divides us, AI will only entrench them further. But if we invest in human capabilities and commit to greater equity, AI can magnify the best of what humanity can achieve. So this is asking for people to be placed at the center. And I think today's report is in line with what is being said here internationally and the lived experience of people the world over. The growing inequalities in Indian society, brought about by a model of development, has indeed excluded large sections of our population. And this has been noticed way back in judgments of the Supreme Court, which go back to 2010. In a decision delivered in 2010, which reviewed the government's decision to give the right to offshore oil reserve exploration to a private corporation, basically Reliance, it was observed, and I quote, "The neoliberal agenda has increasingly eviscerated the state of stature and power, bringing vast benefits to a few, modest benefits to some, while leaving everybody else, the majority, behind. As we cast a glance across the face of our land, the greater incidence of social unrest, movements for greater self-determination seem to occur by and large in states and regions that have plenty of natural wealth and paradoxically suffer from low levels of human development." In July 2010, another bench of the Supreme Court of India remarked, and I again quote, "It is very often the process of development that most starkly confirms the fears expressed by Dr. Ambedkar about our democracy. A blinkered vision of development, complete apathy towards those who are highly adversely affected by the development process, and a cynical unconcern for the enforcement of the laws lead to a situation where the rights and benefits promised and guaranteed under the Constitution hardly ever reach the most marginalized citizens." When we look behind and see in the last 2 or 3 decades, instances of mass displacement of populations, tribal populations, populations of the marginalized and weaker sections, as a result of large projects, particularly dams, we see that the Supreme Court has actually deferred to the so-called executive policy making. And it is only through a majority of voices on the bench, like in the case of the Tehri Dam project, there were 2 judges who went along with the government's policy making. Well, one judge strongly dissented. Likewise, when the Sardar Sarovar project was questioned in the Supreme Court, on a bench of 3, 2 judges went with the government and one dissented. But the dissent, the voice of the dissent in both these decisions was quite powerful. In the Tehri Dam judgment, which goes by the cause title of ND Jayal versus Union of India, the third dissenting judge, Justice Dharmadhikari, acknowledged, and I'm here quoting, "There are economic costs as well as social costs and environmental costs involved in a project of construction of a large dam. The social cost is also too heavy. It results in widespread displacement of local people from their ancestral habitat and loss of their traditional occupations. The displacement of economically weaker sections of the society and tribals is the most serious aspect of displacement from the point of view of uprooting them from their natural surroundings. Absence of these surroundings in the new settlement colonies shatters their social, cultural, and physical links." Likewise, when it came to the Sardar Sarovar project, and here I must make a disclosure that I was a lawyer for the tribals who were displaced by the dams on the Narmada River, one of the largest rivers in India, involving displacement of lakhs of people from their natural and traditional habitats. The dissenting judge spoke on the environmental concerns and how there was no pari passu, rehabilitation of the displaced populations. And here again, the court deferred to the executive policy making. And what we find as far as the Narmada case is concerned is that even after 4 decades, the displaced populations have not got justice. They've all had to leave their natural habitats and move into the neighboring states like Gujarat, Rajasthan, where they're still fighting for survival and for dignity. I found this very striking about the report that has been released today. Despite the experience in the last 2 decades or 3 decades in India, there is no conscious effort to actually shift the course. In 2013, we had a new land acquisition law which asked for social impact assessments before a project is approved. It asked for a participation by local populations among those who are potentially likely to be displaced. Either those processes have not been activated at all or simply given a short shrift. They've allowed states to amend the central law and bypass the requirements of this democratic decision making. So this has resulted in actually people being kept out of important decision making processes concerning location of projects in areas which are dominated by the tribal populations. On the environmental side also, what I have found, both as a lawyer and later as a judge, is those public hearings which have been mandated under the Environment Protection Act are reduced to a ritual, and dissenting voices are either allowed not to, either prevented from actually participating in those public hearings, or it's held in such a hurry and the results have been distorted in a sense that there is a make-believe of compliance with the requirement of the law. So in the actual working, whether it's of the 2013 law or of the Environment Protection Act requirement, there is a subversion, there's an active subversion of the legal processes by the state itself. And it requires a humongous effort on the part of the displaced populations, on the part of the affected populations, to engage with institutions to get them to see the illegality of these processes. So this is a matter for considerable concern when it comes to how the law works on the ground. One of the things that we've noticed increasingly is that there is development through the process of displacement, whether it's large projects, and here I'm talking of dams, but even power projects or construction of expressways and highways. There is no actual reparation for the losses suffered by people. First of all, there's no recognition of the loss suffered. And even if there is a recognition, the reparation is actually half-hearted or totally incomplete. As a Chief Justice of the Orissa High Court, between the years 2021 and 2023, I was astounded to come across petitions asking that the remaining compensation that was to be paid to families displaced by the Hirakud Dam, and this was one of those early Nehruvian era projects, which was inaugurated in 1958. Populations displaced as a result of that large dam project was still in courts asking for complete compensation to be paid. And we're looking at 5 decades having been passed. So this is a failure of the legal processes and definitely a failure of the state to account for the extent of displacement that it is causing and the misery it's causing, not just to the generation that has faced displacement, but every succeeding generations. So if one was to calculate the social costs of the so-called development, it would be humongous. And I'm glad that today's report is again reinforcing the need to acknowledge what is the extent of suffering undergone by people as a result of the so-called development projects. The other is the overall theory of the greater common good. This is always put forth as a justification for these exclusionary policies. All these instances that I've spoken of and today's report reinforce that this is not for the greater common good at all, because it ends up increasing the inequalities, enriching a few at the cost of the many. And this therefore cannot be justified under any yardstick. What are the challenges that we face? One is that as a result of these kind of economic policies, where we've elected governments that seem to align their interests with corporate interests, we are creating what are called oligarchies. In fact, I think the two alphabets A and I encompass within them the names of the two biggest corporate houses of this country. And AI is really a threat in that sense. They have given over large areas of public projects, whether it's airports or ports, exploration, offshore oil exploration, to one or two of these large corporate houses. And we see a withdrawal of the state even from the welfare sector. As was rightly pointed out by Professor Anuradha Chenoy and by the testimonies that have been reported in this today's report, digitization has been used to make the state even less transparent to the people and make the people more transparent to the state. And there is a constant surveillance of any forms of resistance, of any forms of dissent, endangering the lives of people. So we've seen, as a result of encouraging corporate oligarchies, they have used state power to quell dissent And the coercive state machinery follows just not activists, but even journalists, independent journalists, and of late, even lawyers. So no one feels safe if they're standing up to fight for the tribal populations, for those facing displacement. And this is a constant threat that looms over all of them. There is also a lack of political support. And here I'm making a serious case, not just about the government at the center, but even at the governments of the states. They seem to work in tandem or work alike when it comes to quelling popular protests and demands for greater transparency and accountability. And through the instruments of law, they've also shut out civil society groups, whether it's like withdrawal of an FCRA approval or denial of the renewals or cancellation of licenses or unleashing the agencies like the law enforcement agencies. There is an increasing shutting out of civil society activism in this area, which we are now discussing. A combination of all this makes the whole questioning of state actions a very Herculean task. But as was pointed out by Professor Chinoy, by Pamela Philippos, and other speakers, it is heartening to see that there is a new generation of people who, despite all these odds, are prepared to stand up and fight for the people. And it is those voices that we must encourage, we must support with whatever effort we can make at our individual level. It's important, therefore, that this mobilization of support, which is happening through IPTs, is kept on. Very often I've wondered, sitting in court, either as a lawyer or as a judge, what it would be if judges were to participate in such people's tribunals, sitting judges who were to come and watch these processes where people speak in their own voices and in their own language. And how much is lost in translation when the cases are actually presented before the high courts and the Supreme Court of India. And there used to be a time, and I'm talking of the time of Justice Krishnaya in the early 70s, where the judges actually stepped out of their courts. The judges in the Sobraj case and in the Sunil Batra case actually visited Tihar Jail. These were 5 sitting judges of the Supreme Court of India. What would prevent these judges, if they want to know more about the displacement by the Narmada dams, to go and visit the Jalsindhi village in the Narmada Valley? What if they were to hold their sittings of their courts in the places where the actual displacement is taking place? Would it make a difference? Would it make it more real? Would it make it more authentic? And we need to ask these questions because in the kind of system of adjudication that we have in India and perhaps elsewhere in the world, there is a huge distance between people listening to these voices of dissenting voices and voices of people affected by displacement at a geographically far removed place. And what if they have to hear the voices firsthand at the place where the displacement is happening? These are the questions that arise even more forcefully when one reads this report. And the question therefore arises, how do we fight to democratize these processes even more? I would like to end by making a few suggestions. One is the data gathering that we need to do. Because of the processes under the Right to Information Act becoming more cumbersome and the state becoming more opaque, I think occasions like this, the Indian People's Tribunal, will be useful to gather the data and put it in the public domain and share it with all the groups working on the ground. And the increased sharing of data, and this data, I'm sure, should not be only spread in English language. It should be as far as possible vernacularized and made to reach all those groups and individuals working among the affected populations. I would urge that notwithstanding the not too happy results that we may have encountered in courts, we should continue engaging with these institutions, whether it's the judiciary or whether it's those other adjudicatory bodies like the human rights commissions and other commissions that have statutory backing. It is only on constantly engaging with these commissions, notwithstanding the results, that we also record contemporaneous history through the petitions that we file, the documents we place, and the reactions of those institutions. This is very important for future generations to know what works, what doesn't, and what challenges lay ahead. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to say. I must thank the Center for Financial Accountability again, and I would encourage the holding of such tribunals increasingly to bring the people's voices to the fore. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you very much.